Tuesday morning in late October of 2011, a faded blue 1978 Ford F-100 pulled out of the line at the Russell County Cooperative grain elevator and made a slow, wide turn back toward the gravel road. The truck was carrying 18,240 bushels of hard red winter wheat, the entire harvest of 320 acres of Kansas bottomland, and the man behind the wheel was 72 years old. His name was Merritt Calloway, and he had just been told by a machine that his life's work was worthless. Behind him, in a line that stretched nearly a quarter-mile back along the access road, 14 other trucks sat with their engines idling, their drivers watching the strange spectacle unfolding ahead of them. They watched Merritt make the turn. They watched the rejected wheat pass back the way it had come. One of the younger drivers, a kid no more than 24, leaned out his window and laughed. He said something to the driver beside him, loud enough to carry. "There goes the old man's whole year," he said. The other driver smiled but did not laugh. What those drivers did not know, and what almost no one in Russell County would understand for another 4 months, was that Merritt Calloway had been planning that turn since June. The barn he was about to drive home to had been cleaned out and prepared since the middle of summer. The auger he was going to use to move the grain had been bought at auction in August. The mountain of golden wheat that was about to fill the central bay of an oak timber barn built in 1890 was not the result of panic. It was not improvisation. It was the conclusion of a decision that had been made long before the elevator's machinery had ever sampled a single kernel. But to understand that, you have to understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to understand the seed. Merritt Calloway was 72 years old in the fall of 2011. He had been farming the same 320 acres of central Kansas bottomland for 55 of those years, taking over from his father, Asa, who had taken over from his father, who had taken over from a man named Bertram Calloway, who had crossed an ocean in 1888 with 14 heavy canvas bags of turkey red wheat seed sewn into his trunk. Merritt had paid off the last note on his land in 1989. He had not borrowed $1 in the 22 years since. He had $4,200 in his checking account at the First State Bank of Russell, and that account had been roughly that size for as long as anyone there could remember. He never had less than $3,000. He never had more than $5,000. He wore the same kind of denim work shirt he had worn since he was a teenager, buttoned all the way to the neck, even in August, even in the worst of the summer heat. His back had taken on a permanent forward curve from the decades he had spent leaning over engines and squinting at the ground and bending to pick up the heads of wheat, to roll the kernels between his thumb and his forefinger, and feel for the hardness that meant the grain was ready. His hands were the hands of a man who had repaired what other men would have replaced, who had hammered what other men would have welded, who had patched what other men would have torn down and rebuilt. The skin on the back of those hands was thin in some places and thick in others, and there was a scar across the third knuckle of his right hand from a wrench that had slipped in 1968. Around Russell County, Merritt was known for 2 things. He never took a loan, and he never bought new seed. Both of those practices were considered by the modern standards of central Kansas farming in the year 2011 to be relics of a past that was not just inefficient, but actively foolish. The man who had told him so most recently was his own grandson. Let me tell you about the seed, because that is where this whole story begins, and because what was about to happen at that grain elevator could not have happened without it. The 14 canvas bags sat in a small cool room off the main barn. The room had a wooden floor and a pair of small high windows, and a door that Merritt opened every morning during the winter months to check the temperature and the humidity. The bags themselves were not all from the same year. The oldest of them was made of a thick, almost waterproof canvas, and the seams had been stitched with waxed linen thread by a woman named Henrietta Calloway in the spring of 1888 in the kitchen of a sod house that no longer existed. Bertram Calloway had carried that bag and 3 others across the Black Sea and across the Atlantic Ocean and across half a continent, and he had emptied them into a hand-cleared field of central Kansas prairie that his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons had been farming ever since. Over the 4 generations between Bertram and Merritt, the Calloway family had not done what modern agriculture had told them to do. They had not chased uniformity. They had not chased purity. Instead, every year before the harvest, they had walked the fields together, the older men and the younger ones, and they had identified by eye the plants that had performed best that particular year, the ones that had ripened earliest, the ones that had stood tallest after a hard wind, the ones that seemed somehow untouched by the rust that had crept into the neighbor's field, the ones whose roots, when pulled up, ran a foot deeper into the dry summer soil than the roots of the plants beside them. They had harvested those heads by hand, threshed them separately on a clean canvas tarp, and mixed that seed back into the main stock for the next planting. They had been doing that year after year for 123 growing seasons. What they had created, although they did not have the word for it, and would not have used the word if they had known it was what modern geneticists call a land race. Not a single variety, not a hybrid, not a cultivar. A land race is something older and stranger than any of those things. It is a population of plants, a diverse, chaotic, genetically uneven population shaped by the place where it has lived for so long that the place itself has become part of its inheritance. The Calloway wheat was not one kind of wheat. It was 1,000 kinds of wheat all growing in the same field at the same time, each of them slightly different from the others, each of them carrying some small piece of resilience that none of the others quite had. It had no official name. When asked, Merritt called it Calloway wheat. Everyone else in Russell County who had ever looked at it carefully had called it a mess. The man who would refuse to take Merritt's harvest in October of 2011 was named Garrett Linden, and he was 31 years old. Garrett had grown up in Iowa, the son of a hog farmer who had lost his operation in 1986 and had spent the rest of his working life selling insurance. Garrett had gotten his bachelor's degree in agricultural business from Iowa State, and then a master's 2 years after that, and he had been hired by the cooperative in the summer of 2009 to manage the new grain elevator that the board had just spent $4.2 million putting up. Garrett was sharp. He was confident. He was by every honest account a good man. He came to work early and stayed late. He remembered the names of the farmers who pulled up to the scale. He had pushed the cooperative to invest in better testing equipment because he believed with something close to a religious conviction that better data would lead to better prices, and better prices would lead to a better life for the men and women who worked the ground around Russell County. For 2 years, he had been right about that. The cooperative had landed contracts it had never landed before. Farmers who had once pulled up to the elevator and accepted whatever the buyer was paying that week were now getting premiums for protein content, premiums for test weight, premiums for low foreign material. Garrett had brought a kind of precision to the local grain trade that had not existed there before. He had earned the trust of the board. He had earned the trust of most of the farmers. He was in nearly every way that mattered exactly the kind of young man that a small Kansas county hopes will move there and stay. He was not a villain. That is the thing you have to hold in your mind as the story goes on, because it would be easier if he had been one. He was not cruel. He was not lazy. He was not stupid. He was a man who believed in the system. He had been trained to operate, and the system he had been trained to operate had no place at all in it for the work of 4 generations of Calloway men, walking a field with their eyes down, looking for what the wind had not broken. Merritt's grandson Tobin had come back to the farm that spring. Tobin was 22 years old. He had finished his agronomy degree at Kansas State in May, and he had come back to Russell County with his diploma in a cardboard tube and his head full of yield maps and futures contracts and variable rate fertilizer programs. Tobin was not a bad young man. He had loved his grandfather since he was small, had ridden in the cab of that same Ford F-100, since he was barely tall enough to see over the dashboard, had worked the harvest at his grandfather's side every August since he was 12 years old. But 4 years at Kansas State had given him a set of tools, and the tools had changed how he saw the farm. In late September of 2011, about 3 weeks before harvest began, Tobin sat down across from his grandfather at the kitchen table after supper. He had been carrying a manila folder for 2 days and had not opened it. Now he opened it. He laid down a single piece of paper between them. The paper had 3 columns, a row of headings across the top, and a series of figures running down the page in a small, clean font. The numbers, Tobin said, were just the numbers. They were not opinions. They were not feelings. They were just what the math showed. He said the average certified variety in Russell County in the previous 5 years had yielded 67 bushels per acre. He said the Calloway wheat, by his grandfather's own records, had averaged 52 bushels per acre over the same period. He said the difference, multiplied across 320 acres, came out to a loss of about 4,800 bushels a year, at an average price of $6.10 a bushel. Over those 5 years, he said, that was $29,280 a year. Then he ran the numbers a different way, accounting for input costs and the slight premium that Calloway wheat sometimes drew at certain feed mills, and he came up with a number he liked better: $15,040 a year. He said that was the cost in real dollars of preserving those 14 canvas bags. $15,040 a year. He said that over 55 years that came out to a number he had not had the heart to calculate. Merritt did not speak. He looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he looked at his grandson. The kitchen was quiet enough that you could hear the clock above the stove, the same brass mantel clock that had been on that same shelf since Asa Calloway had brought it home from the auction at the Pelletier place in 1962. Tobin said the words then, and he said them with the kindness of a young man who thinks he is helping. "Grandpa," he said, "you are not preserving anything. You are losing money slower than the others are losing it." He said the bags were not a legacy. He said they were a genetic liability. He said the world had moved on, and the world was not coming back. And the only honest thing left to do was admit that what the family had been doing for 123 years was not what the family had been telling itself it had been doing. Merritt did not answer right away. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He sat very still, and then he reached across the table and picked up the piece of paper, and he folded it once down the middle, and he set it back down on the table between them. And he stood up and walked out the back door onto the porch and let the screen door close behind him without slamming. Have you ever been told by someone you raised by your own blood that everything you spent your life building was worthless? Have you ever sat across a table from a young man who loves you, who you taught to ride a horse and to drive a truck, and to read the weather off a Kansas sky, and listen to that young man tell you with numbers that your life had been a slow act of self-deception? If you have, then you know what Merritt Calloway felt that night alone on his porch with the kitchen light coming through the screen behind him, and the late September darkness of central Kansas all around him. If you have not felt that, then I want you to drop a comment below this video and tell me what you think the old man should have said back, because I am not sure I know. Merritt sat on the top step of the porch for nearly 2 hours that night. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He had never done either of those things. He just sat. He could see the dim outline of the small barn across the gravel drive, and he knew, although he could not see them, that the 14 canvas bags were inside that barn, in that small, cool room sitting on the same wooden shelf where his father had set the oldest of them down in the autumn of 1962. He thought for the first time in 55 years of farming, the thought that he had spent his whole life refusing to think. He thought maybe the boy is right. He turned that thought over for a long time. He looked at it from every angle a man can look at a thought. He thought about the years his father had told him about the great rust epidemic of 1954, when the Pawnee variety had failed across Kansas and the Calloway field had not. He thought about the dust storms his grandfather had described when the prairie had blown away, and the wheat that had survived was the wheat that had sent its roots down deep enough to find what was left. He thought about all the stories, and he wondered, sitting in the dark on the porch, whether the stories were just stories, whether men of his grandfather's generation had told themselves comforting things about why they had survived when their neighbors had not, whether the truth was simpler, whether the truth was that the Calloways had been lucky and the luck had run out, and a 22-year-old boy with a manila folder had finally seen it. He went to bed at 11 o'clock without going back inside the kitchen to say goodnight to Tobin. In the morning, neither of them mentioned the conversation. Tobin looked at his grandfather over the breakfast table and saw a man who looked tired in a way Tobin had not seen before. He felt the small, mean pleasure of having won an argument, and then he felt ashamed of feeling it. They drove out to look at the field that morning without saying much. The wheat was almost ready. In another 2 weeks, they would take it in. Now I want to pause here and tell you something about that field, because what was about to happen to it in the months between that conversation and the harvest is the part of the story that no spreadsheet in the world could have predicted. The growing season of 2011 was strange, and it had been strange from the start. It had begun with a late frost on the night of May 12th. The temperature in central Kansas had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit at about 2 in the morning, and it had stayed there for almost 4 hours before slowly climbing back up at dawn. May 12th is 3 full weeks past the historical last frost date for Russell County. No one had been expecting a freeze that late. No one had taken precautions. The young wheat plants in the surrounding fields, the wheat that had been planted in clean uniform rows of certified Pioneer and Syngenta varieties, chosen for early ripening and high yield, took the freeze hard. The tops of the plants seared black in long uniform lines you could see from the road. By the second week of June, the neighbors were walking their fields with their hands on their heads. Merritt's field looked different, because the Calloway wheat was a population and not a variety, because it was 1,000 kinds of wheat. Instead of one, the plants had not all sprouted at the same time. Some were 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Some were 3 weeks behind. Some were already 6 inches tall when the freeze came, and those plants suffered. But many of the others were still just below the soil surface, and they were protected. The field as a whole survived. It did not look pretty. It did not look uniform. It looked, when you stood at the gate and squinted, like a field that had been planted by a drunk and a fool. But it was alive, and the fields around it were not. and within 10 days of the freeze, you could see the difference from the section line. The man who farmed the section just east of Merritt was Hollis Beauchamp. Hollis was 64 years old, a careful operator, a man who read the agricultural magazines and went to the field days, and planted only what the experts at K-State told him to plant. Hollis lost almost half of his wheat to that May 12th freeze. He stood at the fence between his field and Merritt's field on the morning of June 5th, looking at the patchwork of green that was somehow still alive on the Calloway side. And he shook his head, and he said one word out loud, although there was no one to hear it. He said, "Lucky." Then came the summer. From the 1st of June to the middle of August of 2011, Russell County received 2.7 inches of rain. The historical average for that period is 7.4 inches. It was the driest summer the county had seen since 1956, the year a 17-year-old boy named Merritt Calloway had walked his first field at his father's side. The temperature climbed into the high 90s for 37 consecutive days. The wind blew hot out of the southwest. The fields of monoculture wheat varieties bred for high yield in good conditions with root systems that had been selected for ease of harvest rather than depth of reach began to show the strain by the first week of July. Their leaves curled. Their stems thinned. Their color went from a rich gold to a dusty pale yellow. That men of Merritt's generation knew the way sailors know the color of a coming storm. Merritt's field looked different. Some of the plants in the Calloway field had short, thick stalks that hugged the ground and seemed to need almost nothing. Others were tall and thin and somehow kept finding moisture below the surface. Some had a faint waxy coating on their leaves, a feature that had appeared somewhere in the family's seed 3 generations ago and had never been bred out because no one had ever bothered to breed for uniformity. The waxy leaves reduced evaporation. The deep roots on certain plants whose ancestors had been selected after a different drought in 1936 ran a full 8 feet down. The field was not perfect. There were dry patches. There were places where the wheat had given up. But the field as a whole was holding on, and the fields around it were not. And by the end of July, you could stand on the small rise at the north end of the Calloway place and look out and see in every direction except your own a landscape of failure. Merritt walked that field every evening that July. Sometimes Tobin walked with him. Sometimes he walked alone. He did not say much. He pulled a head of wheat now and then. He rubbed the kernels between his thumb and forefinger. He looked at the soil. He looked at the sky. He came home and he sat on the porch and he watched the heat lightning flicker in the distance over fields that would not get the rain those clouds were promising. The harvest came late. The Calloway wheat, because it was a population and not a variety, did not ripen all at once. It ripened in waves. Merritt waited longer than any other farmer in the county. He started his combine on October 24th. The yield came in at 57 bushels an acre. It was not a great year by any honest measure. It was the lowest yield he had taken in more than a decade. But the Russell County average that year, owing to the freeze and the drought, was 29 bushels an acre. Merritt's field had nearly doubled the county average. He looked at the number on the sheet at the end of the second day, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel something that was not quite pride, but was close to it. He thought about the conversation with Tobin in late September. He thought about the manila folder and the column of figures. He did not say anything to his grandson. He just folded the harvest sheet and put it in his shirt pocket. On the morning of October 25th, 2011, Merritt Calloway loaded the first of 19 truckloads. Tobin drove. Merritt rode in the passenger seat silent, watching the familiar landscape of Russell County roll by outside the window. He had been making this drive for 54 years, ever since he had first ridden in his father's truck to the old wooden elevator that had stood on the same spot as the new steel one until 2009. He remembered the wooden tower. He remembered the way it creaked in the wind. He remembered the man who had run it, a man named Ezra Pelham, who had known Asa Calloway by name and had always shaken Asa's hand before he weighed the truck. The new elevator was a different kind of place. The new elevator did not shake anyone's hand. They pulled onto the scale at 20 after 9 in the morning. The digital readout flashed the weight 26,480 pounds of truck and trailer combined, 980 bushels of wheat. The automated probe, a sleek piece of stainless steel about the length of a man's arm, descended into the load with a soft hydraulic hiss. Merritt watched it on the small black and white camera feed mounted inside the office. He saw his wheat, a slow river of golds and ambers and browns flowing up the pneumatic tube and into the testing room. He knew what was coming. He had known what was coming since June. Garrett Linden was at his desk. He had a cup of coffee in his left hand and a computer mouse under his right. His monitor was a large one, and he watched the numbers populate the screen as the near-infrared spectrometer ran its analysis. The first number to come up was the moisture content, 13.8%. A little high, but workable. They could blend it. The second number was the test weight, 60.2 pounds per bushel. Excellent. Heavy, dense, well-filled kernels. Garrett smiled briefly at the screen. He had always liked the old man. He had always thought there was something dignified about him, about the buttoned shirt and the careful way he counted his change at the counter and the truck that should have been replaced 30 years ago. Then the third set of numbers began to come up. The protein readings, the falling number, the variance, 12.1%, 14.3%, 11.8%, 13.5%, 12.7%, 14.1%. The numbers were not converging. The machine was taking dozens of readings from different parts of the same sample, and the readings did not agree with each other. The standard deviation was growing as the test continued. The software tried to compute an average and then displayed in the small red-lettered text that Garrett had seen only twice before in his career. A single phrase across the bottom of the screen. Variance exceeds preset limits. The falling number test, which measured enzyme activity and predicted baking quality, was just as scattered. Some of the readings were high, some were low. The machine could not tell from a single sample whether this was wheat for bread, or wheat for cake, or wheat for cattle feed. The buyers Garrett worked with, the grain merchants in Kansas City and the milling companies in St. Louis, would not blend a load like this into the main bin. It would contaminate everything. It would throw off the protein curve of an entire shipment. They would not pay him for it. They would dock him so heavily that he might as well have been giving it away. Garrett sighed. He printed the report. He carried it out to the truck. Merritt was already standing on the gravel beside the cab. He had not needed to see the printout. He had seen Garrett's face through the window of the office, and he had seen on a face he had come to know fairly well over 2 years the exact expression he had been preparing himself to see since the first week of June. Garrett began the conversation the way he had been trained to begin it. He said the words gently. He said his name. He said he had been taking grain at this elevator for 2 years now, and he had nothing but respect for the Calloway family. And he wanted Merritt to know that none of what he was about to say was personal. Merritt did not move. He stood there in his denim shirt with the buttons all the way to his collar, and he looked past Garrett at the steel tower behind him, and he waited. Garrett held out the printout. He said the protein content of the load was inconsistent. He said the falling number was inconsistent. He said the variance had exceeded the limits the buyers had set, and that meant the cooperative could not accept the load into its main pool. He said he was sorry. He said it was not personal. He said it was just data. Tobin had gotten out of the truck and was standing next to the open driver's side door. He looked at the printout in Garrett's hand, and then he looked at his grandfather. His face was the face of a young man who had warned someone he loved that this was going to happen, and who was now seeing it happen and who did not know whether to feel vindicated or sick. He did not say anything. He waited. Merritt turned his head slowly the way an old animal turns its head, and he looked at Garrett. He said very quietly that he had been bringing wheat to this elevator since before Garrett was born. He said his father had been bringing wheat to this elevator since before Garrett's father was born. He said his grandfather had been bringing wheat to the wooden building that had stood on this same patch of ground since 1923. He said the wheat in that truck had come out of the same soil that all the wheat before it had come out of, and it had been grown the same way, and it had survived a freeze in May and a drought in July, and it had averaged 57 bushels an acre on a year when the county had averaged 29. Garrett listened. He did not interrupt. When Merritt finished, Garrett looked at the printout in his hand, and he looked at the steel tower behind him, and he looked back at Merritt. He said the words he had not wanted to say. He said, "There is no bin for what you have, Mr. Calloway. There is a bin for SY Monument. There is a bin for WB 4458. There is a bin for Everest. There is no bin for Calloway wheat." He said, "I am sorry." He said, "It is just how the system works." Merritt did not raise his voice. He did not point at the tower. He did not curse. He stood there for what felt to Tobin like a very long time. The sun was climbing and the morning was getting warm, and somewhere down the line of waiting trucks, an engine coughed and settled. Then Merritt said one more thing. He said it not loud, but loud enough that Tobin heard it clearly, and loud enough that the driver of the next truck in line who had stepped out for a smoke heard it too. He said, "The system is the problem, son, not the wheat." He turned and walked around the front of the Ford. He climbed up into the passenger seat. He closed the door without slamming it. He did not look at Garrett again. He looked straight ahead through the dusty windshield at the gravel road that led back the way they had come. Tobin stood there for one more moment. He looked at Garrett and Garrett looked back at him. And what passed between them in that single moment was the whole quiet weight of a system that had finally, after 123 years, told a Calloway no. Then Tobin walked around to the driver's side. He climbed in. He started the engine. He put the truck in gear. The wide turn back onto the gravel road took almost a full minute. Tobin made it slowly, partly because the truck was loaded and the gravel was loose, partly because he was 22 years old, and he did not know where else to put what he was feeling. The line of trucks behind them watched him do it. The young driver who had laughed earlier was no longer laughing. The faces in the cabs were the faces of men who had grown up watching their own fathers and grandfathers make decisions in the rain and the wind, and who knew, even if they could not have said it, that they were watching something that did not happen often, and that did not happen lightly, and that did not happen at all, unless something had gone very wrong in the world. The Ford F-100 pulled out onto the county road heading west into the late October sun. The bed of the truck rode low under the weight of 980 bushels of rejected wheat. There were 18 more truckloads to go, sitting in the bins back at the farm. Merritt sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees, looking through the windshield, saying nothing. Tobin drove, and his hands on the wheel were not entirely steady. And for the first time in his life, in a way he could not yet understand, he felt ashamed. Not of his grandfather, of himself. Behind them, the steel elevator caught the morning sun and threw it back across the empty parking lot. Garrett Linden stood beside the unfilled bin where the Calloway wheat had been meant to go, and he held the printout in his hand, and he looked at the small red phrase at the bottom of the page that read, "Variance exceeds preset limits." And he did not yet know that the words on that printout were going to follow him through the rest of the winter and into the spring, and into a part of his life that he had not yet learned was waiting for him. He knew only that he had done his job. He knew only that the data had told him what the data had told him. He knew only what the system knew. The Ford F-100 disappeared over the rise of the county road and out of sight. Inside the cab, Merritt Calloway closed his eyes for just a moment. He was thinking about a barn that had been built in 1890 out of hand-hewn oak beams and wooden pegs. He was thinking about a small cool room at the back of that barn and about 14 canvas bags sitting on a shelf, and about a young man named Bertram who had carried 4 of those bags across an ocean 123 years ago. He was thinking about his father Asa, who had told him once on a windless afternoon in the autumn of 1956 that what survives is what bends, and what is rigid breaks. He was thinking about his wife Della, who had been gone 4 years now, and about a hand that was no longer in his hand, and about a kitchen table that was quieter than it used to be. He was thinking about all of that, and he was thinking about the 18 truckloads of wheat still waiting in the bins at home, and he was thinking about a barn that had been cleaned and prepared and waiting since June. And he was wondering for the first time in many years whether he had been right about any of it. Whether the boy was right, whether the machine was right, whether the world had moved past him, and he was the only one who had not yet noticed. The truck rolled west through the long fields of central Kansas, carrying its rejected harvest, carrying a man who had bet his life on something he could no longer be sure of, carrying a young man who did not yet know that everything he thought he understood about his grandfather was about to be undone. Up ahead, somewhere past the next rise, the gravel drive of the Calloway place waited. The barn waited. The 14 canvas bags waited. And the long, quiet winter that lay between October of 2011 and February of 2012 waited too. And what would happen during that winter would change the way an entire county thought about the ground beneath its feet. But that part of the story comes later. For now, there was only an old Ford pickup truck heading west on a county road, and an old man in the passenger seat with his eyes closed and his hands on his knees, and a young man at the wheel who could not yet bring himself to speak. Have you ever bet your entire life's work on something you could not yet prove? Have you ever stood in a field at the end of a long summer with everything you owned riding on a decision you had made 40 years ago, and wondered whether the man you used to be had been wiser than the man you were right now? If you have, then what comes next will not be unfamiliar to you. If you have not, then I want you to try, just for a little while, to put yourself in the shoes of a 72-year-old man riding home in the passenger seat of his own truck, with 18 more truckloads of rejected wheat sitting in the bins behind him, and a question in his chest that he had not allowed himself to ask in 55 years. The Ford F-100 turned off the county road onto the gravel drive of the Calloway place at 20 after 10 that morning. Tobin parked beside the bins. Neither of them spoke. Merritt opened the door and climbed down slowly the way an older man climbs down from a truck, planting one foot, finding his balance, then the other. He walked across the gravel, and unlocked the wide sliding door of the oak timber barn that his great-grandfather had finished raising in the spring of 1890. He pushed the door open. The smell came out at him the way it always did, the smell of dry oak and of old grain dust and of 121 years of harvests. And he stood there for a long moment in the doorway with the morning light slanting in past his shoulders. Then he walked back to the truck. He climbed up onto the bed. He began to work. It took the rest of that day, and most of the next, to move the wheat. Tobin helped without being asked. The auger Merritt had bought at the auction in Hutchinson in early August. An old Westfield he had paid $1,200 cash for, out of an envelope he kept in a coffee can. In the kitchen did the work it had been bought to do. The grain came out of the F-100 in a slow, steady stream, and rose load by load into a golden mountain in the central bay of the old barn. By sundown on the second day, all 18,240 bushels were in. Merritt slid the door closed. He set the latch. He stood in the gravel drive looking at the closed door for several minutes. Then he walked into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee that was 8 hours old, and he drank it standing at the sink, and he went to bed. That was the night he could not sleep. He lay in the dark for a long time. The wind was up, a dry October wind out of the west, and he could hear it pushing at the loose corner of the porch roof he had been meaning to fix since June. He thought about the bin. He thought about Garrett Linden's face. He thought about the small red phrase at the bottom of the printout. Then, because he could not stop himself, he thought about a single number: $1,847.32. That was the balance in his checking account at the First State Bank of Russell, as of the last statement after the September property tax payment had cleared. He had been carrying that number in his head for 3 weeks and trying not to look at it. Now in the dark, with the wind pushing at the porch roof, he looked at it. The math was not complicated. Property taxes for the next year would come due in March. Seed and fertilizer orders went in around the same time, and although he saved his own seed, there were costs he could not avoid. Diesel had to be bought. The combine needed a new feeder house chain, and that was $400 he had been pretending he did not need to spend. There were 14 other small things on a list he kept in his head, and the total of all of them came to somewhere just north of $9,000, if he was careful, and somewhere closer to $14,000 if he was not. He had $1,847.32 and 18,240 bushels of wheat that no one in the modern grain trade wanted to buy. He sat up at 3 in the morning. He pulled on his boots and his denim jacket. He walked across the gravel in the dark, and he opened the small side door of the old barn, and he turned on the single bare bulb that hung from the rafters above the central bay. And he stood there looking at the mountain of his year's work. The wheat did not look like much in that low light. It looked like what it was, a heap of small, dry seeds, several million of them, the product of 320 acres, and one hot summer, and one freezing May night, and 4 generations of careful walking. He walked over to the small cool room at the back of the barn, the one with the wooden floor and the high windows, and he opened the door, and he turned on the light there too. The 14 canvas bags sat on the shelf where they had always sat. The oldest one, the one Henrietta Calloway had stitched in the spring of 1888, sat in the middle. He put his hand on it. The canvas was thinner now than it had been in 1888. His mother had patched it once in 1947. He had patched it himself in 1986. The waxed linen thread was almost black with age. He stood there with his hand on the bag for a long time. Then he sat down on the wooden floor with his back against the wall, the way he had sat as a boy, listening to his father talk about wheat. and he closed his eyes and he said out loud into the empty room the question he had been refusing to ask. He said, "Father, I do not know if you were right anymore." The words did not echo. The room was too small for that. They just hung in the air for a moment, and then they were gone. No one answered him. Della had been gone 4 years. Asa had been gone since 1978. Bertram had been gone since 1923. The room held only Merritt and the bags and the dust. And Merritt sat there for nearly an hour. And then he stood up slowly. And he turned off the lights and he walked back across the gravel to the house. And he climbed the stairs. And he lay down beside the empty side of the bed where his wife had slept for 42 years. And he closed his eyes and he did not sleep. Now let me tell you about Asa Calloway, because what was about to keep Merritt going through the next 4 months had nothing to do with science and nothing to do with markets, and almost everything to do with a conversation that had taken place on a windless afternoon in the autumn of 1956, when Merritt was 17 years old and his father had walked him out into the field for the first time and shown him how to look. Asa Calloway in 1956 was 49 years old. He was a quiet man, a man who did not tell stories often, but the stories he did tell tended to land in the back of the listener's head and stay there. That afternoon in 1956 was the harvest season after the worst drought Central Kansas had seen in 20 years. The Calloway field had come in at 38 bushels an acre. The county average that year had been 19. Asa had walked his son out into the stubble of the harvested field, and he had pulled up a single dried wheat root from a place where the combine had missed a row, and he had held it up to the boy. The root went down almost as long as Asa's arm. He had said, "This one is why we still have a farm." He had told the boy in a voice that was soft and certain that what survives is what bends, and what is rigid breaks. He had said the wheat in the bag was not a single thing. He had said it was 1,000 things, and the bag was the family's memory of which 1,000 had survived. And the survival of the family came from the survival of the 1,000 and a man's job. On this particular ground was to walk the field every spring and every fall, and to remember with his eyes and with his hands which plants the land had blessed that year, and to put them into the bag for next year. He had said the bag was older than any of them. He had said the bag would outlast all of them. He had said the only thing that was being asked of any Calloway man was to walk the field and not forget. He had said it once that afternoon. He had not said it again ever in the 22 more years he had left to live. Merritt had walked the field every spring and every fall since 1957. He had filled 55 small notebooks with what he saw. The notebooks were in a wooden drawer in the desk in the corner of the kitchen. He had written every entry by hand. He had not skipped a year even in 1973 when he had nearly lost the farm to a different drought. Even in 1980, when the interest rates had been 21.5%, and a seed dealer named Dugan had spent 2 hours at the kitchen table trying to talk him into a hybrid program that promised yield gains of 38%. Even in 2007, when Della had been sick and dying, and he had not been sure he would have the heart to plant another crop after she was gone. In 1973, the drought had been worse than 2011. The Calloway field had come in at 41 bushels an acre that year. The county average had been 16, but Merritt at 34 had not yet had his father's stillness, and he had nearly bent. He had stood in the kitchen one night that August with a piece of paper in his hand from the Federal Land Bank, and he had told Della he thought they ought to consider selling the South Quarter to pay down the operating note. Della had been 34 herself, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. and she had looked at him with the steady gray eyes that had made him ask her to marry him 8 years before. And she had said one sentence, and that sentence had ended the conversation. She had said your father did not keep those bags, so you could throw them away in one bad summer. Merritt had folded the piece of paper. He had not signed it. He had not gone to the bank. The drought had broken in late September, and the wheat that had hung on through August had hung on long enough, and the harvest had paid the note. He had never asked Della to talk about it again, and she had never offered. But he remembered the sentence. He had remembered it in 1980, when Dugan had come with the hybrid program. He had remembered it in 1989, when the last note on the land had been paid off, and he had sat on the porch with a glass of buttermilk and looked at his deed for the first time, without a lien on it. He had remembered it in 2007 in the small bedroom at the back of the house, when Della had taken his hand for the last time and had not had to say anything because she had said it all already. Asa had died in the winter of 1978, a heart attack in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with his coffee cup still half full on the counter. Merritt had been 39. The 14 canvas bags had passed to him that day, without ceremony, the way they had passed to Asa from his own father in 1949. Without ceremony, the way nothing important in a Calloway family had ever required ceremony. Asa's last words to his son in the hospital the night before had not been about the bags. They had been about the truck. He had said, "Do not buy a new one if you can fix the old one." Then he had closed his eyes. Then he had not opened them again. In 1991, the man who farmed the section north of Merritt was named Sutter Beauchamp. Sutter was Hollis's older brother. He was 58 that year, and he had spent most of the 1980s trying to claw back from a 1979 expansion that had loaded him with debt at exactly the wrong moment in agricultural history. In the spring of 1991, the bank finally caught up with him, and he sold his 480 acres at auction to a corporation out of Wichita. The day after the auction, he walked across the section line to Merritt's place and stood at the fence with his hands in the back pockets of his jeans and watched Merritt work on a fuel pump. He did not say anything for almost an hour. Then he said more to the air than to Merritt. "Why did you not go under like the rest of us?" Merritt set down his wrench. He wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at his neighbor. He said after a moment, "Because I never owed anyone." Sutter nodded once. He did not say anything else. He walked back across the section line, and he was gone from Russell County by Christmas. That sentence, more than anything Asa had ever said to his son, had become the spine of the next 20 years of Merritt Calloway's life. Because I never owed anyone. He had thought about it on the porch at night. He had thought about it on the long, slow rounds of the combine in August. He had thought about it the day the property tax statement came in the mail every February. And he had thought about it the day the agricultural extension agents had come around in 1997, trying to sell him on a corn ethanol contract that would have required him to take on $80,000 in new equipment debt. And he had thought about it in 2003, when the John Deere dealer in Hayes had offered him a trade-in deal on his combine that would have cost him only $1,400 a month for the next 8 years. He had not signed any of those papers. He had never owed anyone since the spring of 1989, and so he had never since 1989 had to do anything any banker or seed company or equipment dealer told him to do. But none of that history was much help to him on the night of the rejection, lying in the dark with $1,847.32 in his checking account and 18,240 bushels of wheat in a barn that almost no one in the modern grain trade believed had any commercial value. The history of a man's life can give him the courage to stand in one place. It cannot by itself tell him whether the place where he is standing is going to hold. What changed in the long, slow weeks between the rejection in late October and the news from Pratt County in mid-January was not anything Merritt did. What changed was that Merritt kept doing what he had always done. He walked the field even though it was empty. He read the notebooks his father had left him, the ones from the 1930s and the 1940s, and he read his own notebooks, the ones from 1957 onward. And he sat at the kitchen table with the small stove going and the coffee pot warm. And he traced with his finger the years his father had also walked through hard times and the years his grandfather had. And he tried to remember line by line what those years had asked of those men and what those men had given in return. In late November, on a cold Tuesday afternoon, Tobin came to the door of the small cool room at the back of the barn. He had not been in that room more than 3 times in his life. Merritt was sitting on a low wooden stool with one of his notebooks open on his lap. The light from the high windows was thin and gray. Tobin stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he said quietly, "Grandpa, what are we going to do?" Merritt did not look up right away. He turned a page in the notebook. He read for another moment. Then he closed the notebook and he set it on the shelf beside him, and he looked at his grandson. He said, "We wait." Tobin said, "Wait for what?" Merritt said, "For the world to need what we have." Tobin did not say anything to that. He stood there for a long moment, and then he went out and closed the door. Merritt heard the gravel crunch as the boy walked across the drive back to the house. He sat on the stool a long time after that. He did not open the notebook again that day. Have you ever waited for something you were not sure was coming? Have you ever staked your reputation, your savings, your relationship with your own grandson on a faith in something that no one around you could see, and that you yourself could no longer quite remember why you believed in? If you have, then what comes next will feel like an old friend. If you have not, then I want you to drop a comment below this video and tell me whether you think the old man was being faithful, or whether he was being foolish, or whether the difference between those two things is sometimes only visible from the far side of a winter. In early December, the second week on a clear, cold morning with frost on the gravel, a broker out of Wichita named Carl Petrosian called the house. Merritt answered the kitchen phone on the 3rd ring. Carl introduced himself. He said he had heard through a complicated route involving a feed mill in Hutchinson and a friend of a friend at the cooperative that Merritt was sitting on a sizable lot of wheat that had not made grade. He said he was sorry to hear that. He said he wanted to make Merritt an offer. Carl said the offer was $5.50 a bushel, taken as is picked up at the farm, paid in full on delivery. He said it was salvage feed grade pricing, and he was being generous to call it that. He said the going rate for that kind of variance was usually closer to 4. He said the total, if Merritt accepted, would come to $132. He said it was a clean deal, no questions, no testing, no fuss. Merritt stood in the kitchen with the phone against his ear. He did not say anything for a long moment. He could hear Carl breathing on the other end of the line. He looked out the kitchen window at the gravel drive and the closed door of the old barn beyond it. $100, $320. That was the property taxes paid. That was the diesel for the next year. That was the feeder house chain on the combine. That was a margin of safety he had not had since the night of the rejection. That was a man being able to sleep again. Tobin had walked into the kitchen during the call and was standing in the doorway. He had not meant to overhear. He had come in for coffee, but he had heard Carl's number through the receiver, even from across the room, and now he was standing very still, looking at his grandfather, his hands at his sides. Merritt said into the phone, "I appreciate the offer." Carl said something Merritt did not quite hear. Carl was a salesman, and he was already moving on to closing language. Merritt said again more firmly, "I appreciate the offer." He paused. The kitchen clock ticked. He said not yet. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Carl said with the practiced patience of a man who has heard this answer before, "Mr. Calloway, I want to be straight with you. Wheat that is sitting in a private barn in central Kansas in December does not get more valuable as the winter goes on. It gets less valuable. Every week, mice, moisture, the market shifts. I am offering you a way out of a bad situation today. I am not going to be able to offer you the same number in February." Merritt closed his eyes for a moment. He saw the small, cool room at the back of the barn. He saw the canvas bag with the waxed linen thread. He saw his father's hand on a long, dry root in 1956. He saw Della at the kitchen table in 1973, with the steady gray eyes. He said, "I understand." He said, "Thank you for calling." He said not yet. Then he set the phone in the cradle. Tobin stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he came across the kitchen and sat down at the table without saying anything. Merritt did not turn around right away. His hand, when he finally took it off the receiver, was shaking just slightly. He did not want the boy to see it. He stood at the window for almost a full minute with his back to the kitchen, looking at the closed door of the old barn. Then he turned. He walked to the table. He sat down across from his grandson. Tobin looked at him. He said very carefully, "Grandpa, that was $100,000. Merritt said, "I know." Tobin said that was the taxes. That was next year's seed money. That was everything. Merritt said, "I know." Tobin said with something just shy of anger in his voice, "Then why?" Merritt was quiet for a long time. He did not know how to say the thing he was about to say. He had not had the conversation with anyone, not even Della, not in those exact words. He looked at his grandson. He looked at the table. He looked at the kitchen. The old brass clock above the stove. The coffee pot. The manila folder still sitting on the corner of the table where Tobin had laid it down in late September. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at the boy. He said, "Because there is a kind of patience that is not the same thing as waiting. And there is a kind of waiting that is not the same thing as patience. And the difference between them is the difference between a man who knows what he has and a man who does not." Tobin did not understand. Merritt could see that he did not understand. Merritt did not blame him. He had not understood either when his father had said similar things to him, although the words had been different. He reached across the table and put his hand on the boy's wrist. For just a moment, the first time he had touched his grandson with anything other than a passing pat on the shoulder in nearly 2 years. He said, "I am asking you to wait with me." Tobin did not answer. He looked at the table. His eyes were wet, and he did not want his grandfather to see. And so he stood up and he poured himself a cup of coffee. He did not actually want, and he stood at the counter with his back turned for a long time. Then he came back to the table and he sat down, and he said, finally the only thing he could think of to say. He said, "Okay, Grandpa." He said, "Okay." That was the 11th of December. For the next 6 weeks, Merritt walked the field. He walked it in light snow. He walked it in clear cold. He walked it on a day in early January when the temperature did not get above 18 degrees, and the wind out of the north was so sharp it brought tears to his eyes. There was nothing to see in the field. The stubble was the same color as the dirt. The crows came and went. He walked it anyway. He walked it because his father had walked it, and his grandfather had walked it. And the walking, more than anything else, was what told the land that it was still being kept. He went into the barn every evening and looked at the mountain of wheat. He climbed the small wooden ladder up the side of the bin and ran his hand through the top layer to check for moisture, for warmth, for the first faint hint of mold that would have meant the harvest was beginning to spoil. There was nothing. The barn was dry. The wheat was clean. He climbed back down. He turned off the light. He walked across the gravel to the kitchen. Tobin was not always there. The boy had taken a part-time job in town that December, working at the hardware store partly for the money and partly because he could not stand to sit in the kitchen all winter in the silence of his grandfather's waiting. Merritt did not mind. He understood. He had been 22 once. The 10 o'clock news came on the local station on the evening of January 13th. Merritt was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes. He almost did not hear the story. It was buried halfway through the broadcast between a piece about a school bond issue in Hayes and a piece about a high school basketball game in Salina. The anchor read it in the same flat voice he read everything in. A cattle feedlot in Pratt County had reported an unusual cluster of livestock illnesses over the past several weeks. The state veterinarian's office was investigating. Early indications suggested the problem might be feed-related. The story took less than 30 seconds. The anchor moved on to weather. Merritt set down the dish he was drying. He stood very still at the sink. He looked out the dark kitchen window at the gravel drive and the closed door of the barn. Tobin was at the table behind him, half asleep over a magazine. Merritt said without turning around, "Did you hear that?" Tobin looked up. He had not heard it. He had not been listening. Merritt did not explain. He finished drying the dish. He set it in the rack. He said, "Get the radio." The kitchen radio was on a shelf above the refrigerator, and Tobin got up and turned it on and tuned it to the Hutchinson AM station that ran agricultural news on the half hour. They stood together in the kitchen. The old man and the young man, one with a dish towel still in his hand, one with his magazine forgotten on the table behind him, and they listened. The 11 o'clock farm report came on at the top of the next half hour. The reporter, a woman with a careful voice, read the story with more detail than the local news anchor had. She said the Pratt County feedlot in question had lost 47 head of cattle since Christmas. She said the symptoms were consistent with mycotoxin poisoning. She said the state veterinarian had ordered samples from multiple feed sources. She said preliminary results were pointing toward the wheat component of the feed. She said similar reports were beginning to come in from Edwards County and from Stafford County. She said the state was monitoring the situation. She said feed wheat from the 2011 harvest was now under review. The radio moved on to a corn futures report. Tobin reached over and turned it off. The kitchen was very quiet. The brass clock above the stove ticked. The wind, which had been picking up all evening, pushed at the porch roof. Merritt set the dish towel on the counter slowly. He did not say anything. He did not have to. He turned to his grandson. The boy was looking at him with an expression that had not been on his face the last time the boy had stood in this kitchen and looked at his grandfather. It was not amusement. It was not condescension. It was something closer to the look a man wears when he realizes for the first time that he has been standing for a long time on the wrong side of a story. Merritt walked to the back door. He took his jacket off the hook. He pulled it on without speaking. He stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold and dry, and the gravel was hard with frost, and the moon was low in the west over the empty fields. Tobin came to the doorway behind him. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe, and he looked at his grandfather, and he did not yet say what he wanted to say. Merritt walked across the gravel to the old barn. He pulled open the side door. He turned on the single bulb above the central bay. The light caught the mountain of wheat and turned it gold, the way it had been gold in the field in late October. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. The wheat had not changed. The wheat had been the same all winter. What had changed was a small story on a radio station out of Hutchinson and a wind that had begun to shift somewhere out beyond the edges of central Kansas, and a system that had told a 72-year-old man in October that what he had brought to the elevator was worthless. The wind pushed at the side of the barn. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called and was answered by another, and they were both quiet again. Merritt walked across the wide barn floor to the door of the small cool room at the back. He opened it. He turned on the light. He walked to the shelf with the 14 canvas bags. He put his hand on the oldest one, the one with the waxed linen thread that Henrietta Calloway had stitched in the spring of 1888. He stood there for a long moment. Then very quietly, the way a man speaks to someone he loved a long time ago and who is no longer there, he said, "Father." He said, "I think it is starting." Tobin was still standing in the doorway of the barn behind him, watching, although Merritt did not know it. The boy did not come closer. He did not interrupt. He stood in the cold doorway with his hand on the frame, and he watched his grandfather speaking to a canvas bag in a small lit room, and something inside him shifted in a way that he would not be able to name for some time afterward and would not try to. The wheat in the central bay caught the light. The wind kept pushing at the barn. Out in the night, somewhere far to the south, a feedlot in Pratt County was waiting for test results that would come back in 5 more days. And the news from those test results would travel north through the cattle counties and east toward Wichita and west into the Panhandle. And within 3 weeks, the entire commercial wheat supply of the Central Plains would be under a quiet and growing cloud. But none of that was visible yet on the night of January 13th, 2012. There was only an old barn and a mountain of grain, and a man with his hand on a canvas bag, and a young man in a doorway who was beginning for the first time in his life to understand what his grandfather had been waiting for. The test results out of Pratt County came back on the 18th of January. The state veterinarian's office released its preliminary findings at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and by 6 o'clock the story had moved from the farm report to the regular evening news. The wheat component of the feed at the Pratt County operation had tested positive for mycotoxin and zearalenone at levels well above the safety threshold for ruminant livestock, particularly for young animals and pregnant cows. The state veterinarian recommended that all feedlot operators in central and western Kansas review their wheat sourcing for the previous 90 days and request mycotoxin testing on any lot purchased from regional grain elevators since the start of the 2011 harvest. By the 25th of January, the story had moved out of the local news and into the wire services. The Kansas City Star ran a piece that morning. The Wichita Eagle ran a piece the same afternoon. By the end of the week, the cattle trade publications were running it on their front pages, and the major feed suppliers in Texas and Oklahoma had begun rejecting wheat shipments from Kansas elevators that could not produce clean mycotoxin certificates dated within the last 14 days. The price of certified clean feed-grade wheat, which had been trading at $7.80 a bushel on the Chicago Board of Trade in late December, climbed to $9.40 by the 1st of February, and to $11.20 by the 7th, and to $13 by the 11th. There was almost none to be had. The drought stress that had defined the previous summer had created the perfect breeding ground for the fungi that produced those toxins, and the uniform vulnerability of the certified varieties that almost every farmer in the region had planted meant that the contamination was not local. It was regional. It was systemic. It was a single failure repeating itself across 10 million acres. Merritt heard about it the way he heard about most things in pieces from the radio in the kitchen, and from the men at Larry's Cafe in town when he stopped in for coffee on Saturday mornings. He did not say much when the men talked about it. He listened. He drank his coffee. He paid his ticket. He drove home. He walked the field. He went into the barn in the evenings and ran his hand through the top of the bin to check for moisture. The wheat was clean. The wheat had been clean since October. The wheat in his barn was the only wheat in the eastern half of the state of Kansas that no one had yet thought to ask about. That changed on the morning of February 3rd. It was a Friday. The sky over Russell County was the kind of pale, cold blue you only get in central Kansas in early February, and the temperature at sunrise had been 7 degrees, and the gravel in the drive was hard as iron under the tires. Merritt was in the kitchen at 20 past 9 finishing his second cup of coffee when he heard the truck come up the drive. It was not a truck he recognized. He stood up from the table. He looked out the kitchen window. The truck was a Ford F350 dark blue, 2 years old at most, with dual rear wheels and the kind of grill guard that ranchers put on the front when they have to push livestock around in the snow. The man who climbed out of it was a big man, mid-50s, in a heavy canvas coat and a brown felt hat, and he stood beside the driver's door for a moment looking around at the place before he walked toward the house. Tobin was already in the kitchen, having come in from the porch when he heard the engine. Merritt set down his coffee. He walked out onto the porch and met the man at the bottom of the steps. The man took off his hat. He held it against his chest. He said, "My name is Ellis Marsden." He said, "I have a cattle operation in Bertram County." He said, "I think you might have something I need." Merritt looked at him for a long moment. He did not invite him onto the porch. He did not ask him into the house. He said, "How did you hear about it?" Ellis said, "There is a feed broker in Hutchinson named Carl Petrosian." He said, "I called Carl 2 weeks ago, looking for clean wheat." He said, "Carl told me the cleanest wheat he had not been able to buy was sitting in a private barn in Russell County." He said, "It took me 10 days to figure out whose barn." Merritt almost smiled. It would have been the first time he had smiled in 3 months. He did not. He said instead, "Come around back." He led Ellis Marsden across the gravel to the side door of the old oak timber barn. Tobin followed at a distance. Merritt slid the door open. The morning sun came in past their shoulders and lit the central bay, and the mountain of golden wheat caught the light, the way it had caught the light of the single bulb on the night of January 13th. But in the daylight it looked different, and Ellis Marsden, who had been in many barns in his life, stopped in the doorway and did not speak for almost a full minute. He had brought a portable testing kit with him. He carried it back to the truck and set it on the open tailgate. He pulled a sample from 3 different points in the bin, the top, the middle, and the bottom, and he combined them in a small, clear plastic cup, and he ran the test. It was the same kind of test the state veterinarian had been running at Pratt County. It looked for the same compounds. The kit took about 6 minutes. Merritt and Tobin and Ellis stood at the back of the truck. none of them speaking while the kit ran. The wind moved across the gravel. Somewhere out in the section, a hawk called. The kit beeped. Ellis read the screen. He read it again. He turned the screen so Merritt could see it. The mycotoxin readings were below the detectable limit, not low. Below the threshold the kit could measure. The diverse, deep-rooted, waxy-leafed Callaway wheat had not been stressed enough during the drought to invite the fungi that had ruined the rest of the region's crop. Its messiness, the very thing the elevator had refused it for, had been its protection. Ellis Marsden looked at Merritt. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "What is your price?" Merritt did not hesitate. He had been thinking about this for 4 months. He had run the numbers in his head 100 different ways, in the barn at night on the porch, at dusk in the cab of the truck, on the way back from town. He had thought about what was fair. He had thought about what was deserved. He had thought about what a man owed to his father and his grandfather, and to a woman named Henrietta Calloway, who had stitched a canvas bag in the spring of 1888. He said, $15 a bushel. Tobin made a small sound in his throat. He had not meant to. The sound was not a word. It was just air. The going market price for clean wheat that morning was hovering around $13.20 a bushel. 15 was almost $2 over market. It was nearly twice what the elevator would have paid in October. It was in dollars and cents, $273,600. Ellis Marsden did not flinch. He did not look at the ground. He did not look at his hat. He looked at Merritt for what felt like a very long time. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and took out a checkbook and a pen. He wrote the check on the open tailgate of the F350, leaning on a clipboard with the morning sun coming in over the barn roof behind him and the cold wind moving across the gravel. He tore the check out. He held it out to Merritt with one hand. With the other hand, he reached out and took Merritt's hand and shook it. The grip was firm and dry, and it lasted no more than 2 seconds. He said, "I will have trucks here Monday morning." That was it. That was the whole transaction. There was no contract. There was no handshake before the deal, only one after it. There was no negotiation. There was no haggling. There was no celebration. There was a check for $273,600 written in blue ink on the tailgate of a Ford pickup truck in the cold sun of a February morning in central Kansas. And there was a man who had known what his wheat was worth for 4 months, and another man who had been desperate enough to come find it. Ellis Marsden put on his hat. He climbed back into the F350. He nodded once to Tobin through the open window, and once to Merritt. He started the engine. He turned the truck around in the gravel. He drove out the way he had come. The dust hung in the cold air for almost a minute after the truck was gone. Merritt stood there with the check in his hand. He looked at it. He folded it once lengthwise the way his father had folded the harvest sheet in 1956. He put it in the pocket of his denim shirt, the one with the small button at the top, and he buttoned the pocket closed. Then he sat down on the bottom step of the barn doorway, slowly the way an older man sits down, and he put his hands on his knees and he did not say anything for a very long time. Tobin sat down next to him. The two of them sat side by side on the step in the cold sun, looking out across the gravel drive and the section road and the empty stubble of the field beyond it. And neither of them spoke for almost 20 minutes. There was nothing to say. Merritt did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and older than triumph. He felt that his father had been right. He felt that a woman named Della had been right when she had said the words at the kitchen table in 1973. He felt the long, thin thread that ran from a sod house in 1888 to an oak timber barn in 2012. And he felt himself sitting on that thread. And he felt that he had not in the end broken it. Finally, after a long time, Merritt stood up. He walked into the kitchen. He set the check on the counter beside the coffee pot. He poured himself another cup of coffee. He stood at the sink and drank it slowly. Tobin came in behind him. The boy did not say anything. He stood in the doorway. After a while, Merritt turned and looked at him. Merritt said, "Your grandmother was right about everything that mattered." Tobin nodded. His eyes were wet. He did not try to hide it this time. He said, "Yes, sir." That was the climax of the story, although neither of them knew it in that moment. Not the check, not the price. The two men sitting on a barn step in the cold sun, and the old man saying the words about his wife, and the young man saying, "Yes, sir." That was the moment. The rest of what was about to happen, and the rest of what would unfold over the next 10 years, was just the long, slow weather of a story that had already been decided. Have you ever sat next to a man you love and watched him be right about something you had told him he was wrong about? Have you ever sat in a kitchen with a check on the counter that was worth more than your last 3 years of wages combined, and felt nothing about the check at all, and felt everything about the words the old man had just said? If you have, then you know what Bertram Calloway felt that February morning, and you do not need me to describe it any further. The trucks came on Monday morning the way Ellis Marsden had said they would. 3 semi-tractor trailers, one after the other all morning. Merritt and Tobin worked the auger together and loaded them. They did not speak much. They did not need to. By Wednesday afternoon, all 18,240 bushels were gone riding south toward Bertram County. The barn was empty for the first time since late October. The mountain was a memory. Merritt swept the central bay clean with a wide push broom the way his father had swept it after every harvest in his lifetime, and he closed the door and he set the latch. The story moved through the county slowly at first, then faster. By the second week of February, the men at Larry's Cafe were talking about it openly. By the third week, the cooperative board had heard about it. By the fourth week, on a Thursday afternoon, an old Honda Accord came up the gravel drive of the Calloway place and stopped in front of the house, and Garrett Linden got out of it. He was not the same man who had handed Merritt the printout in October. He had aged 5 years in 3 months. There were dark circles under his eyes. His shirt was clean, but it was not pressed. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he looked up at Merritt, who had come out onto the porch when he heard the engine. Garrett did not say he was sorry. He had thought about saying it on the long drive over from town, and he had decided against it. Sorry was not the word for what had happened. And Merritt was not the kind of man you said sorry to in a situation like this. So he did not say sorry. He said something else. He said, "Mr. Calloway." He said, "I was wrong about the system." He said, "I was not wrong about the data. I was wrong about which data I was reading." Merritt looked at him from the porch. He did not invite him up. He did not refuse him either. He just looked at him. Garrett went on. He said the cooperative was in trouble. He said most of the wheat in the main bins was now under quarantine, and the corporate buyers were not taking it. He said the board was looking at a 60% revenue shortfall for the year. He said he had been spending the last 3 weeks trying to understand how a system that had been built on the best available science had failed so completely. And he said he was beginning to think the answer was that the science had been measuring the wrong thing. He said he wanted to learn. He said he did not know who else to ask. Merritt did not say anything for a long moment. He looked past Garrett at the gravel drive and the closed door of the old barn. He thought about the printout in October. He thought about the small red phrase at the bottom of the page. He thought about the line of trucks behind him as he had made the wide turn back onto the county road. He thought about the young driver who had laughed. He said, "Finally come back tomorrow." He said, "Bring your testing kit." He said, "I will show you what diversity looks like in 14 different bags." Garrett nodded once. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. He got back in the Honda and drove away. The dust hung in the air the way it had hung after Ellis Marsden's truck. Although this dust was a different kind of dust and the man who had raised it was carrying a different kind of weight. The next morning, Garrett was back at 9 o'clock. He had his testing kit. He had a notebook. He had the patience of a young man who had decided somewhere on the long drive back to town the day before that he was going to spend the rest of his career trying to understand what he had refused to see in October. Merritt walked him into the small, cool room at the back of the barn. He showed him the 14 canvas bags. He told him the names of the years and the names of the men. And he told him the story Asa had told him in 1956 about what survives and what bends. Garrett listened. He took notes. He did not interrupt. That was the beginning of an arrangement that would, over the next 8 years, change the way the Russell County Cooperative did business. Garrett would come out to the farm 2 or 3 times a year after that. Sometimes alone, sometimes with a younger employee he was training, sometimes with a buyer from a specialty mill in St. Louis who wanted to see the field. He never apologized for October. Merritt never asked him to. The two men did not become friends exactly, but they developed a kind of professional respect that went deeper than friendship would have the respect of two men who had been wrong and right about each other in different ways at different times, and who had learned late that the difference between the two was smaller than either of them had once believed. Hollis Beauchamp came to the farm in March. He did not call ahead. He knocked on the kitchen door at 3 in the afternoon with his hat in his hand, and he asked Merritt if he might be willing to sell him 50 bushels of seed for the spring planting. Merritt looked at him for a moment. Then he said the price, $40 a bushel. It was almost 5 times the price of certified seed. Hollis did not blink. He paid in cash $400 bills and the rest in 20s out of an envelope he had been keeping in his glove compartment, and he loaded the bushels into his truck himself. And he drove home and he planted them on his own ground that April. He never spoke a word about it to Merritt afterward. Merritt did not expect him to. By the end of that planting season, 11 other farmers in 3 counties had bought seed from Merritt. By the next year, the number was 31. By 2014, when the second drought of the decade hit Kansas, and the same regional mycotoxin problem began to reappear in lots of varying severity, Merritt was selling 1,800 bushels of seed a year to farmers in 5 states, and he was charging $50 a bushel, and the demand was outrunning the supply. Tobin handled the logistics. He had not, in the end, taken the job in Wichita that he had been considering in late September. He had stayed on the farm. He had begun to walk the field with his grandfather every spring, and he had begun to keep a notebook of his own in his own hand, in the manner that Asa had walked the field with Merritt in 1956, and that Bertram had walked the field with the boy who would become Asa's father in 1893. Tobin asked his grandfather one evening in 2015 why he had not raised the seed price further. The demand was such that he could have. Merritt was 76 then. He was sitting on the porch with a glass of buttermilk. He thought about the question for a while. Then he said, "Because the bag is not for sale." He said only the seed in it is, Tobin did not ask again. In 2017, Merritt was 78 years old. His back was bad. The arthritis in his hands had gotten worse. He could no longer drive the combine for more than 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, and the long days of harvest had become difficult. He sat down at the kitchen table with Tobin one evening in late August, and he told him the operation was his to run from then on. He said he would still walk the field. He said he would still keep his own notebook. He said he would still be there to answer questions. But the decisions, he said, were now Tobin's. Tobin did not say anything for a long time. He nodded. He did not protest. He had been preparing for that conversation for 2 years. In 2019, Garrett Linden, who had become the general manager of the Russell County Cooperative in 2016, oversaw the construction of 4 small specialized bins at the elevator. The bins were designed to hold and segregate landrace grains. The board had approved the project after a year of debate. The corporate buyers Garrett had worked with for so many years had begun slowly to develop premium contracts for grains with unique resilience profiles, and the cooperative had decided it could no longer afford to be only a gatekeeper for the commodity giants. There was a small ceremony when the bins were finished. Merritt did not attend. He was 80 by then, and he did not much like ceremonies. Tobin attended on his behalf. Garrett shook Tobin's hand at the end of it. The 2 men did not speak afterward. They did not need to. In the spring of 2021, on a windless afternoon in late April, Merritt walked out to the small, cool room at the back of the barn with a roll of new canvas and a spool of waxed linen thread. He was 82. The oldest of the 14 bags, the one Henrietta Calloway had stitched in 1888, had finally given out. The seams had failed in 3 places over the winter. He had been putting off the work for almost a year. That afternoon, he sat on the wooden floor of the small, cool room the way he had sat there in October of 2011, with his back against the wall, and he carefully transferred the seed from the old bag into a new one. He stitched the new bag closed, himself by hand with a curved upholstery needle that had belonged to his mother. The seed in the new bag was the direct descendant by 124 years of careful selection of the seed Bertram Calloway had carried across the Black Sea in his trunk. The canvas was new. Everything inside it was old. He set the new bag on the shelf where the old one had been. He folded the old canvas and put it in a paper sack and carried it into the house, and he set it on the desk in the kitchen where he could see it from the table. In the spring of 2022, Merritt Calloway died on the porch of the house his great-grandfather had finished building in 1894. It was a Sunday morning in late April. He was 83. He had been sitting in his rocker since dawn, looking out across the gravel drive at the field where the new wheat was about 3 inches tall and just beginning to take its color. Tobin found him at about 8:30 when he came up to the house for breakfast. The old man's hand was still resting on the arm of the rocker. His eyes were closed. There was the faintest trace of a smile on his face, the kind of smile a man wears when he has just thought of something pleasant and has not yet stopped thinking about it. The doctor said it was his heart. The doctor said it had probably been quick. Tobin held his grandfather's hand for a long time before he called the doctor or the funeral home or anyone else. He sat next to him on the porch in the cool morning air, and he held his hand, and he leaned in after a while, and he said the only thing he could think of to say. He said, "I am walking the field, Grandpa." He said, "I will keep walking it." He said every spring. Merritt's funeral was 3 days later. The little Lutheran church in Russell was full. There were people there who Tobin had never seen before, farmers from Nebraska and Oklahoma. and the panhandle of Texas men who had bought seed from his grandfather over the years. Men who had stood at the fence line and shaken their heads in 1973 and 1980 and 2011, and had come in their own time to understand. Hollis Beauchamp was there. Carl Petrosian was there, although Tobin did not know him. Ellis Marsden drove up from Bertram County. He stood at the back of the church the whole time, holding his hat against his chest. Garrett Linden came in late and stood at the back as well. And the two of them, Garrett and Ellis, did not know each other. But they nodded once across the room when their eyes met, the way men nod who have been changed by the same person, without ever having compared notes. Merritt was buried next to Della in the small cemetery on the rise at the north end of the home section. From the cemetery, you could see the field. Tobin had asked the grave to be dug there, because Merritt had asked years ago that he be put where he could still see his ground. The headstone was simple. It said his name and his dates, and below that in smaller letters, 4 words that Tobin had chosen himself. The words were, "He walked the field." Now I want to tell you something. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world. There is the knowledge of the spreadsheet, which is wide and thin. It can see everything at once, but it cannot see deep. It seeks to simplify. It seeks to standardize. It seeks to make the world predictable. And then there is the knowledge of the canvas bag, which is narrow and deep. It is the accumulated wisdom of one place, of one family over generations. It does not seek to simplify the world. It seeks to embrace its messiness because it has learned the long way that the messiness is what survives. The modern world runs on the spreadsheet. That is a fact. That is not going to change. But survival, when survival comes, when the freeze comes in May, or the drought comes in July, or the toxin comes in January, survival runs on the bag. What is optimized for one outcome is fragile. What is built for resilience in all its messy and unpredictable diversity is what endures. Merritt Calloway did not get rich. The check Ellis Marsden wrote that February morning paid the property taxes and bought a feeder house chain and a new fuel pump for the combine. And what was left went into the same kind of small, steady savings that the family had always kept. He bought the 160-acre parcel adjacent to his land when it came up for sale in 2013, and he did not plant it. He restored it to native prairie. It became a buffer for the field and a haven for the pollinators and the beneficial insects, and a quiet place where a man could walk in the evenings and listen to the wind in the bluestem grass. He did not get rich. He stayed free. There is a difference. And every spring now, somewhere out in Russell County, a man walks his field. He walks it slowly. He walks it alone. He carries a small notebook in the back pocket of his jeans, and the notebook is in his own hand. He does not walk it to count the bushels. He does not walk it to measure the protein. He walks it because his grandfather walked it, and his great-grandfather walked it, and a man named Bertram Calloway walked the same ground in 1893, with a boy who would grow up to be Asa Calloway's father. He walks it because the land remembers and someone has to remember with it. If you have a canvas bag in your life, something old, something your family kept, that everyone told you to throw out, something that did not match the spreadsheet of the world you found yourself living in, I want you to think about that bag tonight. Think about who stitched it. Think about who carried it. Think about whether the long, thin thread that runs from their hands to yours is one you have been keeping or one you have been letting go. Drop a comment below this video. Tell me about your bag. Tell me about your field. Tell me about the old man or the old woman or the quiet, stubborn person in your life who refused at the right moment to listen to the room. I want to know. Because the story of Merritt Calloway is not just the story of one man. It is the story of every family that has ever decided against the noise of the world to walk the field anyway. The wheat is up again this spring in Russell County on a 320-acre parcel that has been in the same family since 1888. The new bins at the cooperative are running. The young manager who took over after Garrett moved on to a state-level position keeps a bin reserved for what is now formally listed in the cooperative's records as Calloway Landrace, the only landrace grain in the state of Kansas, with its own grading category. Tobin Calloway is 33 years old. He is married. He has a son 2 years old who is just beginning to walk. And on the warm afternoons, he carries the boy out to the edge of the field and sets him down in the soft dirt. And the boy puts his hands flat on the ground, the way Merritt put his hands on the ground in the long July of 2011. And the boy does not yet know what he is doing, but his hands are doing it anyway. The land remembers. Someone has to remember with it.